Before there was the United States, there was a battlefield. For more than 150 years, North America wasn't a nation. It was this chaotic, sprawling continent of rivals. You had different European empires and countless Native American nations, all competing for land, for resources, and, well, for survival. Today, we're going to break down how this fractured landscape of competing colonies somehow began to forge a new, shared identity.
So, here's how we'll walk through it. We'll start with that initial kind of desperate race for just a foothold on the continent. Then we'll see how these different empires built vastly different societies. We'll explore how the English colonies grew to dominate the coast, how those diverse colonies then began to see themselves as a unified whole, and finally, how that very unity planted the seeds of a revolution that would literally change the world.
All right, let's dive right in. In the late 16th century, the great powers of Europe turned their gaze west to North America, and they launched these ambitious expeditions that were more often than not completely and utterly doomed to fail.
So, who were the main players in this high-stakes game? Well, you had England, France, Spain, and the Dutch Republic. Each one saw North America as a source of unimaginable wealth and a huge strategic advantage over their rivals back in Europe. So they all just jumped into this fierce competition to claim a piece of the so-called New World.
But man, getting a colony started was brutally difficult. The death rate for these early settlers was terrifyingly high. They were dealing with starvation, diseases they'd never seen before, and constant conflict. Some of these early attempts just vanished. The most famous, of course, is the English colony at Roanoke. The settlers disappeared without a trace, leaving behind just one cryptic clue, the word Croatoan carved into a post. So you have to ask, why take such a massive risk? Well, the main driver was this economic theory called mercantilism. The idea was pretty simple. A nation's power was measured by its wealth, specifically its gold and silver. Colonies were seen as these giant resource farms, existing for one reason, to supply the mother country with raw materials and then turn around and buy its manufactured goods. It was all about enriching the empire.
But it wasn't just about money, not for everyone. For thousands of ordinary people, that treacherous journey across the Atlantic represented something far more valuable than gold. It represented a chance for freedom.
A lot of these groups were fleeing religious persecution. You had the Pilgrims, who were a type of Puritan, escaping England to set up a community in Plymouth where they could just practice their faith freely. You had Quakers, led by William Penn, who founded Pennsylvania as this holy experiment in religious tolerance. And Maryland was established in part as a safe haven for Roman Catholics, who faced a ton of discrimination back in Protestant England.
Okay, so you've got these different motivations: God, gold, glory, freedom. How did that actually play out on the ground? Well, it led to three vastly different types of colonial societies, each with its own totally unique blueprint for how to conquer and settle this new land. And just look at how stark those differences were. You can really see three distinct models pop up. Spain was laser-focused on converting natives and extracting wealth. France was all about the fur trade and making alliances. But England was focused on something that would turn out to be a total game-changer, planting large permanent settlements packed with people. New Spain was just enormous. It stretched all the way from modern-day Florida to California. The whole Spanish model was built on a network of Catholic missions to convert native populations and military forts called presidios to defend their claims. It was this huge empire of control, but with surprisingly few actual Spanish colonists living there.
Now, New France was just as vast, but structured completely differently. It was basically a massive business venture built around the incredibly profitable fur trade. The French set up trading posts and forts all along the Great Lakes and the Mississippi River, and they relied on crucial economic and military alliances with Native American tribes instead of large-scale settlement. And then you have the English model, which was the real outlier. It wasn't some centrally controlled system. It was this patchwork of different colonies all up and down the Atlantic coast. Their whole focus was on agriculture and building permanent towns. And this focus on putting down roots, on bringing over whole families, not just soldiers or traders, that is the single biggest reason English America, not New France, would end up dominating the continent. So, that brings us to the key question, right? With all these powerful empires competing, how did the English colonies not only survive, but eventually come to completely dominate the continent's eastern seaboard? The answer really lies in their diversity and their people. See, a huge reason for their success was that English America wasn't just one thing. It was a collection of distinct regions, each with its own personality. You had the strict Puritan New England, focused on tight-knit communities and trade. You had the incredibly diverse Middle colonies.
Then there was the Chesapeake, totally dominated by tobacco, and the lower South with its rice and indigo economies. And of course, on the edge of it all, you had the ever-expanding frontier. This quote from a Pennsylvania newspaper just perfectly captures the spirit of those middle colonies. Unlike the rigid aristocratics of Europe or the plantation hierarchy in the South, this region was defined by a thriving middle class of farmers and craftsmen and merchants. It was a society that really valued hard work and offered a level of social mobility that was just unheard of at the time.
But we have to be clear. The growth of these colonies, especially in the South, depended on forced labor. At first, this was mostly indentured servitude, where poor Europeans would agree to work for, say, 4 to 7 years in exchange for their passage to America. But over time, this system was replaced by a much more brutal and permanent one: chattel slavery, based on race, where enslaved Africans and their children were considered property for life.
Now, for most of their early history, these colonies were incredibly different from one another. They were often suspicious, even hostile to each other. So let's get into the pivotal moment when these separate settlements began to see themselves not as Virginians or New Yorkers, but as part of a single, powerful British-American identity. And this iconic cartoon by Benjamin Franklin is such a powerful symbol of that shift. It was published right at the start of a massive conflict, the French and Indian War, and it sent a crystal-clear message. The colonies, represented by the pieces of this snake, had to unite against a common enemy, or they would be picked off and destroyed one by one.
The French and Indian War was the American part of a much bigger global conflict called the 7 Years' War. It all started over competing claims in the Ohio Valley, but it blew up fast. And here's the crucial thing. For the very first time, colonists from Georgia to Massachusetts were fighting side by side, along with British regular troops, against the common enemy. The tide really turned when Prime Minister William Pitt decided to pour massive resources into North America. The British capture of Quebec in 1759 was the decisive blow, and the Treaty of Paris in 1763 didn't just end the war, it completely redrew the map of the continent, kicking France out for good.
So here's the key takeaway. After this huge, shared victory, the colonies were more connected to Britain than ever. They were proud British subjects who had beaten their arch-rivals, the French. And this connection was also economic. Colonists developed a huge appetite for British goods, and exports from Britain to America surged by an incredible 360% in just 3 decades.
Okay, we're about to hit the major turning point in this whole story. And hey, if you're finding this useful, do me a favor and take a quick second to like this explainer and subscribe. That way you won't miss what happens next.
But here is the great irony of it all. The very war that united the colonists and solidified their identity as proud British subjects also planted the seeds of their rebellion. That victory came at a massive cost, and Great Britain was about to send the bill straight to America.
Britain had won, but it was drowning in debt, and Parliament decided the American colonies should start paying for their own defense. So, for the first time, they began imposing direct taxes. First came the Stamp Act in '65, taxing everything made of paper, which sparked absolute outrage. Then you get the Townshend Acts on imported goods. When colonists protested with the Boston Tea Party, Parliament's response was furious. They passed the Intolerable Acts, which basically shut down the government in Massachusetts. Each step was an escalation, driving the colonies further and further down the road to open rebellion.
By 1776, the entire mood had shifted. The argument wasn't about the rights of British subjects anymore. Now it was about independence. And no one captured that feeling more powerfully than Thomas Paine in his incredible pamphlet, Common Sense. His simple, direct words, "'Tis time to part," just electrified the colonies and made the case for a complete break.
And so, after a century and a half of struggle, competition, and conflict, a new American identity had been forged in the fire of war and protest. The colonies were finally united, but the biggest question of all remained. Could these 13 colonies possibly defeat the full might of the British Empire and create a nation of their own?
Well, the answer to that question would define the course of modern history. You can find out what happens next in our explainer on the American Revolution, which is the very next video in our U.S. History Timeline playlist. Thanks for watching.